On this video, I'm going to continue reading from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays written in the 1800s. Please feel free to share your thoughts, your comments, your feedback, your insights. What do you think of my reading style? Does it resonate with you? Do you have any comments you'd like to share about the insights, concerning the insights I've shared through my reading? Please feel free to let me know. And please subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me as I read this amazing book. We shall continue. A natural skill for mensuration, growing out of his mathematical knowledge and his habit. Before I continue, I just want to let you know that this current essay is about Mr. Thoreau, who is very close to Ralph Waldo Emerson. A natural skill for mensuration, growing out of his mathematical knowledge and his habit of ascertaining the measures and distances of objects which interested him, the size of trees, the depth and extent of ponds and rivers, the height of mountains, and the ear-line distance of his favorite summits. This and his intimate knowledge of the territory about Concord made him drift into the profession of land surveyor. It had the advantage for him that it led him continually into new and secluded grounds and helped his studies of nature. His accuracy and skill in this work were readily appreciated, and he found all the employment he wanted. He could easily solve the problems of the surveyor, but he was daily beset with graver questions which he manfully confronted. He integrated every custom and wished to settle all his practice on an ideal foundation. He was a Protestant. All his practice on he was a Protestant, a outrance, and few lives contain so many renunciations. He was bred to no profession. He never married. He lived alone. He never went to church. He never voted. He refused to pay a tax to the state. He ate no flesh. He drank no wine. He never knew the use of tobacco. And though a naturalist, he used neither trap nor gun. He chose wisely, no doubt for himself, to be the bachelor of thought and nature. He had no talent for wealth, and knew how to be poor without the least hint of squalor or elegance. Perhaps he fell into his way of living without forecasting it much, but approved it with later wisdom. Quote, I am often reminded, end quote, he wrote in his journal, quote, that if I had bestowed on me the wealth of Crusius, my aims must be still the same, and my means essentially the same, end quote. He had no temptations to fight against, no appetites, no passions, no taste for elegant trifles. A fine house dress, the manners and talk of highly cultivated people were all thrown away on him. He much preferred a good Indian and considered these refinements as impediments to conversation. Wishing to meet his companion on the simplest terms, he declined invitations to dinner parties because there each was in everyone's way, and he could not meet the individuals to any purpose. Quote, they make their pride, end quote. He said, quote, in making their dinner cost much, I make my pride in making my dinner cost little, end quote. When asked at table what dish he preferred, he answered, quote, the nearest, end quote. He did not like the taste of wine and never had a vice in his life. He said, quote, I have a faint recollection of pleasure derived from smoking dried lily stems. Before I was a man, I had commonly a supply of these. I have never smoked anything more noxious, end quote. He chose to be rich by making his wants few and supplying them himself. In his travels, he used the railroad only to get over so much country as was important to the present purpose, walking hundreds of miles, avoiding taverns, buying a lodging in farmers' and fishermen's houses, as cheaper and more agreeable to him, and because there he could better find the men and the information he wanted. They was somewhat military in his nature, not to be subdued, always manly and able, but really tender, as if he did not feel himself except in opposition. He wanted a fallacy to expose a blunt pillory. I may I may say required a little sense of victory, a roll of the drum, no call to call his powers into full exercise. It cost him nothing to say no. Indeed, he found it much easier than to say yes. It seemed as if his first instinct on hearing a proposition was to controvert it. So important was he are the limitations of our daily thought. This habit, of course, is a little chilling to the social affections, and though the companion would in the end acquit him of any malice or untruth, yet it mars conversation. Hence no equal companion stood in affectionate relation with one so pure and guileless. Good, I love Henry, and good, said one of his friends. Good, but I cannot like him. And as for taking his arm, I could as soon think of taking the arm of an elderly, end quote. Yet hermit and stoic as he was really fond of sympathy, and threw himself heartily and childlike into the company of young people whom he loved, and whom he delighted to entertain, as he only could with the varied and endless anecdotes of his experiences by field and river, and he was always ready to lead a huckleberry party or a search for chestnuts or grapes. Talking one day of a public discourse, Henry remarked that whatever succeeded with the audience was bad. I said, quote, who would not like to write something which all can read, like Robinson Crusoe? And who does not see with regret that his page is not solid with a right materialistic treatment, which delights everybody? End quote. Henry objected, of course, and voted the better lectures, which reached only a few persons. But at supper, a young girl, understanding that he was to lecture at Lyceum, sharply asked him, good, whether his lecture would be a nice, interesting story, such as she wished to hear, or whether it was one of those old philosophical things that she did not care about. End quote. Henry turned to her and bethought himself, and I was trying to believe that he had matter that might fit her and her brother, who were to sit up and go to the lecture if it was a good one for them. He was a speaker and actor of the truth, born such, and was ever running into dramatic situations from the schools. In any circumstance, it interested all bystanders to know the part Henry would take and what he would say, and he did not disappoint the expectation, but used an original judgment on each emergency. In 1845, he built himself a small framed house on the shores of Waldo Pond, and lived there 2 years alone, a life of labor and study. This action was quite native and fit for him. No one knew him. No one knew him would take. No one who knew him would tax him with affectation. He was more unlike his neighbors in his thought than in his action. As soon as he had exhausted the advantages of that solitude, he abandoned it. In 1847, not approving some uses to which the public expenditure was applied, he refused to pay his own tax and was put in jail. A friend paid the tax for him, and he was released. The like annoyance was threatened next year, but as his friend paid the tax, notwithstanding his protests, I believe he ceased to resist. No opposition or ridicule had any weight with him. He coldly and fully stated his opinion without affecting to believe that it was the opinion of the company. It was of no consequence if everyone present held the opposite opinion. On one occasion, he went to the university library to procure some books, but the librarian refused to lend them. Mr. Thoreau repaired to the president, who stated to him the rules and usages which permitted the loan of books to resident graduates, to clergymen who were alumni, and to some others resident within a circle of 10 miles radius from the college. Mr. Thoreau explained to the president that the railroad had destroyed the old scale of distances, that the library was useless, yes, and president and college useless on the terms of his rules, that the one benefit he owed to the college was its library, that at this moment not only his want of books was imperative, but he wanted a large number of books, and assured him that he, Thoreau, and not the librarian, was a proper custodian of these. In short, the president found the petitioner so formidable, and the rules getting to look so ridiculous, that he ended by giving him a privilege which in his hands proved unlimited thereafter. no true American exited than Thoreau. His preference of his country and condition was genuine, and his aversion from English and European manners and tastes almost reached contempt. He listened impatiently to news or bemoans gleaned from London circles, and thought he tried to be civil. These anecdotes fatigued him. The men were all imitating each other, and on small mold. Why can't they not live as far apart as possible, and each be a man by himself? What he thought was the most energetic nature, and he wished to go to Oregon, not to London, in every part of Great Britain, He wrote in his diary, I discovered traces of the Romans, their funeral urns, their camps, their roads, their dwellings, but New England at least is not based on any Roman ruins. We have not to lay the foundations of our houses on the ashes of a former civilization, But idealist as he was, standing for abolition of slavery, abolition of tariffs, almost for abolition of government, it is needless to say he found himself not only unrepresented in actual politics, but almost equally opposed to every class of reformers. Yet he paid the tribute of his uniform respect to the anti-slavery party, one man whose personal acquaintance he had formed. He honored with exceptional regard before the first friendly word had been spoken for Captain John Brown. He sent notices to most houses in Concord that he would speak in a public hall on the condition and character of John Brown on Sunday evening, and invited all people to come. The Republican committee, the abolitionist committee, sent him word that it was premature and not advisable. He replied, I did not send to you for advice, but to announce that I am to speak, The hall was filled at an early hour by people of all parties, and his earnest eulogy of the hero was heard by all respectfully, by many with a sympathy that surprised themselves. It was said of Plotinus that he was ashamed of his body, and it is very likely he had good reason for it, that his body was a bad servant, and he had not skill in dealing with the material world as happens often to men of abstract intellect. Mr. Thoreau was equipped with a most adapted and serviceable body. He was of short stature, firmly built, of light complexion, with strong, serious blue eyes, and a grave aspect. His face covered in late years with a becoming beard. His senses were acute, his frame well knit and hardy, his hands strong and skillful in the use of tools, and there was a wonderful fitness of body and mind. He could pace 16 rods more accurately than another man could measure them with rod and chain. He could find his path in the woods at night. He said, better by his feet than his eyes. He could estimate the measure of a tree very well by his eye. He could estimate the weight of a calf or a pig like a dealer. From a box containing a bushel or more of loose pencils, he could make up with his hands fast enough just a dozen pencils at every grasp. He was a good swimmer, runner, skater, boatman, and would probably outwalk most countrymen in a day's journey. And the relation of body to mind was still finer than we have indicated. He said he wanted every stride his legs made, the strength of his walk uniformly made the length of his riding. If shut up in the house, he did not write at all. He had strong common sense like that which Rose Flammock, the weaver's daughter in Scott's romance, commends in her father as resembling a yardstick, which whilst it measures dowlas and diaper, can equally well measure tapestry and cloth of gold. He had always a new resource. When I was planting forest trees and had procured half a peck of acorns, he said that only a small portion of them would be sound, and proceeded to examine them and select the sound ones, but finding this took time. He said, I think if you put them all into water, the good ones will sink, which experiment we tried with success. He could plan a garden or a house or a barn, would have been competent to lead a Pacific exploring expedition, could give judicious counsel in the gravest private or public affairs. He lived for the day, not cumbered, not mortified by his memory, If he brought you yesterday a new proposition, he would bring you today another not less revolutionary. A very industrious man and steady, like all highly organized men, a high value on his time. He seemed the only man of leisure in town, always ready for any excursion that he promised well, or for conversation prolonged into daily hours, into late hours. His trenchant sense was never stopped by his rules or daily prudence, but was always up to the new occasion. He liked and used the simplest food. Fat. When someone urged a vegetable diet, Thoreau thought all diets a very small matter, saying that, quote, the man who shoots the buffalo lives better than the man who boards at the Graham house. And quote, he said, quote, you can sleep near the railroad and never be disturbed. Nature knows very well what sounds are worth attending to, and has made up her mind not to hear the railroad whistle. But things respect the devout mind, and a mental ecstasy was never interrupted. Unquote. He noted what repeatedly befell him, that after receiving from a distance a rear plant, he would presently find the same in his own horns. And those pieces of luck which happen only to good players happened to him. One day, walking with a stranger who inquired where Indian arrowheads could be found, he replied, quote, everywhere, end quote, and stooping forward picked one on the instant from the ground at Mount Washington in Tuckerman's Raven. Thoreau had a bad fall and sprained his foot, and he was in the act of getting up from his fall. He saw for the first time the leaves of the Arnica mollis. His robust common sense, armed with stout hands, keen perceptions, and strong will cannot yet account for the superiority which shone in his simple and hidden life. I must add the cardinal fact that there was an excellent wisdom in him, proper to a rare class of men, who showed him the material world as a means and symbol. This discovery, which sometimes yielded to poets a certain casual and interrupted light, serving for the ornament of the writing, was in him an unsleeping insight, and whatever faults or obstructions of temperament might cloud it, he was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. In his youth he said one day, quote, the other world is all my art. My pencils will draw no other. My jackknife will cut nothing else. I do not use it as a means, end quote. This was the muse and genius that ruled his opinions, conversation, studied work, and course of life. This made him a searching judge of men. At first glance he measured his companion, and though insensible to some fine traits of culture, could very well import his weight and caliber, and this made the impression of genius which his conversation sometimes gave. He understood the matter in hand at a glance, and saw the limitations and poverty of those he talked with, so that nothing seemed concealed from such terrible eyes. I have repeatedly known young men of sensibility converted in a moment to the belief that this was the man they were in search of, the man of men who could tell them all they should do. His own dealing with them was never affectionate, but superior, didactic, scorning the petty ways, very slowly conceding or not conceding at all the promise of his society at their houses, or even at his own. Quote, he would not walk with them, end quote. Quote, he did not know there was nothing so important to him as his walk. He had no walks to throw away on company, end quote. Visits were offered him from respectful parties, but he declined them. Admiring friends offered to carry him at their own course to the Yellowstone River, to the West Indies, to South America. But though nothing could be more grave or considered than his refusals, they remind one in quiet new relations of that fop Brummel's reply to the gentleman who offered him his carriage in a shower, quote, but where will you run then, end quote. And what accusing silences, and what searching and irresistible speeches, battering down all defenses his companions can remember. Mr. Thoreau dedicated his genius with such entire love to the field, hills, and waters of his native town that he made them known and interesting to all reading Americans and to people of the sea. The river on whose banks he was born and died, he knew from its springs to its confluence with the Merrimack. He had made summer and winter observations on it for many years, and at every hour of the day and night. The result of the recent survey of the water commissioners appointed by the state of Massachusetts. He had reached by his private experiments several years earlier. Every fact which occurs in the bed, on the banks, or in the air over the fishes in their spawning and nests, the manners of their food, the shade, flies which fill the air on a certain evening once a year, and which are snapped at by fish so ravenously that many of these dies of repletion. The conical heaps of small stones on the river shallows, the huge nests of small fishes, one of which will sometimes overfill a cart, the birds which frequent the stream, heron, duck, sheldrake, loon, osprey, the snake, muskrat, otter, woodchuck, and food on the banks, the turtle, frog, hyla, and cricket which make the banks vocal, were all known to him, and it were townsmen and fellow creatures, so that he felt an absurdity or violence in any narrative of one of these by itself apart, and still more of its dimensions on an interval, or in the exhibition of its skeleton, or the specimen of a squirrel, or a bird in brandy. He liked to speak in the manners of the river, as itself a lawful creature, yet with exactness and always to an absurd fact. And he knew the river to the ponds in this region. One of the weapons he used, more important than microscope or alcohol receiver to other investigators, was a whim which grew in him by indulgence, yet appeared in graver statement, namely of extolling his own town and neighborhood as the most favored center for natural observation. He remarked that the flora of Massachusetts embraced almost all the important plants of America. Most of the oaks, most of the willows, the best pines, the ash, the maple, the beech, the nuts. He returned Kane's Arctic voyage to a friend of whom he had borrowed it, with the remark that, quote, most of the phenomena noted might be conserved in Concord, unquote. He seemed a little envious of the pole for the coincident sunrise and sunset, or 5 minutes day after 6 months. A splendid fact which Snook had never afforded him. He found red snow in one of his walks, and told me that he expected to find yet the Victoria Regia in Concord. He was attorney of the indigenous plants, and owned to a preference of the weeds to the imported plants, as of the Indian to the civilized man, and noticed with pleasure that the willow bean poles of his neighbor had grown more than his beans. See these weeds, end quote, he said, quote, which have been hoed at by 1,000,000 farmers all spring and summer, and yet have prevailed and just now come out triumphant over all lanes, pastures, fields, and gardens, such as the vicar. We have insulted them with low names too, as pigweed, wormwood, chickweed, shadblossom, end quote. He says, quote, they have brave names too: ambrosia, stellaria, amelanchia, amaranth, etc., end quote. I think his fancy for referring everything to the meridian of Concord did not grow out of any ignorance or depreciation or deprecation of other longitudes or latitudes, but was rather a playful expression of his conviction of the indifferency of all places, and that the best place for each is where he stands. He expressed it once in this wise, quote, I think nothing is to be hoped from you. If this bit of mold under your feet is not sweeter to you to eat than any other in this world, or in any world. End quote. The other weapon with which he conquered all obstacles in science was patience. He knew how to sit immovable, a part of the rock he rested on, until the bird, the reptile, the fish, which had retired from him, should come back and resume its habits, nay, moved by curiosity, should come to him and watch him. It was a pleasure and a privilege to walk with him. He knew the country like a fox or a bird, and passed through it as freely by paths of his own. He knew every track in the snow or on the ground, and what creature had taken this path before. One must submit abjectly to such a guide, and the reward was great. Under his arm he carried an old music book, two brass plants in his pocket, his diary and pencil, a spyglass, birds, microscope, jackknife, and twine. He wore a straw hat, stout shoes, strong grey trousers, to brave scrub oaks and smilax, and to climb a tree for a hawk's or a squirrel's nest. He waded into the pool for the water plants, and his strong legs were no insignificant part of his armor. On the day I speak of, he looked for the Menianthes, detected it across the wide pool, and on examination of the florets, decided that it had been in flower 5 days. He drew out of his breast pocket his diary, and read the names of all the plants that should bloom on this day, whereof he kept account as a banker in a notes. Waldo, the Cypripedium, not due till tomorrow. He thought that if waked up from a trance in this swamp, he could tell by the plant what time of the year it was within 2 days. The red spot was flying about, and presently the fine grosbeaks, whose brilliant scarlet coat makes the rash gazer wipe his eye, and whose fine clear note throat compared to that of a tanager, which has got rid of its hoarseness. Presently he heard a note, which he called that of the night warbler, a bird he had never identified, had been in search of 12 years, which always when he saw it was in the act of diving down into a tree or bush, in which it was vain to seek, the only bird which sings indifferently by night and by day. I told him he must be beware of finding and booking it, lest life should have nothing more to show him. He said, quote, when you seek in vain for half your life, one day you come full upon all the family at dinner. You seek it like a dream, and as soon as you find it, you become its prey. End quote. His interest in the flower or the bird lay very deep in his mind, was connected with nature, and the meaning of nature was never attempted to be defined by him. He would not offer a memoir of his observations to the Natural History Society. But why should I? To detach the description from its connections in my mind would make it no longer true or valuable to me, and they do not wish what belongs to it. Quote, his power of his observation seemed to indicate additional senses. He saw as with microscope, heard as with ear trumpet, and his memory was a photographic register of all he saw and heard, and yet none knew better than he that it is not the fact that imports, but the impression or effect of the fact on your mind. Every fact lay in glory in his mind, a type of the order and beauty of the whole. His determination on natural history was organic. He confessed that he sometimes felt like a hound or a panther, and if born among Indians would have been a fell hunter. But restrained by his Massachusetts culture, he played out the game in this mild form of botany and ichthyology. His intimacy with animals suggested that Thomas Fuller records of Butler, the apiologist, that, quote, either he had told the bees things of the bees, quote, either he had told the bees things or the bees had told him, end quote. Snakes coiled round his legs. The fishes swam into his hand, and he took them out of the water. He pulled the woodchuck out of its hole by the tail and took the foxes under his protection from the hunters. Our naturalist had perfect magnanimity. He had no secrets. He would carry you to the heron's haunt, or even to his most prized botanical swamp, possibly knowing that you could never find it again, yet willing to take his risks. No college ever offered him a diploma or a professor's chair. No academy made him its corresponding secretary, its discoverer, or even its member. Perhaps these learned bodies feared the satire of his presence. Yet so much knowledge of nature's secret and genius few others possess, none in a more large and religious synthesis, for not a particle of respect had he to the opinions of any man or body of men, but homage solely to the truth itself. And as he discovered everywhere among doctors some leaning of courtesy, it discredited them. He grew to be revered and admired by his townsmen, who had at first known him only as an oddity. The farmers who employed him as a surveyor soon discovered his rare accuracy and skill, his knowledge of their lands, of trees, of birds, of Indian remains, and the like, which enabled him to tell every farmer more than he knew before of his own, so that he began to feel a little as if Mr. Thoreau had better rights in his land than he. They felt, too, the superiority of character which addressed all men with a native authority. I'm going to end the book here. Please feel free to share your thoughts, your comments, your feedback, your insights. What do you think of my style of reading? Does it resonate with you? Look forward to hearing from you. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me as I read this amazing accumulation of essays. I love you. Have a lovely day. Keep on shining a beautiful light.